As I walked through my son-in-law's new mansion to leave a family heirloom, my eyes caught a slight imperfection in the basement's custom wine cellar, a gap in the crown molding no wider than a quarter-inch. Being a retired construction supervisor, I couldn't help but reach out to touch it. The moment my fingers applied pressure, I heard a heavy, industrial click. A section of the oak shelving swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a soundproofed room I didn't know existed. I stepped inside, my heart hammering against my ribs, and what I found there made my knees buckle and the air leave my lungs. Because the daughter I had mourned and buried 3 years ago was sitting right there, alive, staring back at me from the edge of a narrow cot. Thank you for being here. Before we get into the rest of this incredible journey, please hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Just a quick note. This is a fictional story with dramatized elements for storytelling and educational value. While the events are imagined, the message about the strength of a father's intuition is very real. Now, let me tell you how this all began. The drive up the winding coast had been quiet, the kind of silence that usually brings me peace, but today it felt heavy. I looked at the passenger seat where Brittany's old music box sat, the last piece of her I had left. It had been exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 5 days since the police told me my daughter hadn't survived that car fire. I was headed to Dylan's new estate, a glass and steel fortress that felt more like a monument to his wealth than a home. I just wanted to drop off the heirloom and leave, to find some way to reconnect with a world that hadn't felt right since the day I watched them lower an empty casket into the ground. I had no idea that by the time the sun went down, everything I thought I knew about my life, and the man my daughter had married, was about to be demolished. The heavy oak paneling settled into place behind me with a muffled thud, sealing us into a room that smelled of ozone and stagnant air. My heart wasn't just beating, it was slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. On the edge of a narrow cot sat a woman who looked like a shadow of the child I'd raised. Her chestnut hair was long and matted, and her hazel eyes, the same eyes that used to light up when we'd go for Sunday drives, were wide with a terror so profound it made my blood run cold. "Brittany," I whispered, the name feeling like glass in my throat. She flinched, pulling her knees to her chest. "Dad." The word was barely a breath, a ghost of a sound from a woman I had wept over for 3 years. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing my worn flannel sleeve as if checking to see if I was made of mist. When she felt the solid reality of my arm, she collapsed into me, a sob racking her thin frame. "He told me you were dead. He told me everyone was gone." "I'm right here," I said, my voice hardening with a resolve I hadn't felt in decades. My construction training kicked in, the ability to assess a structure and find the exit. I didn't have my tools, but I had my hands and a lifetime of knowing how buildings were put together. "We have to go. Now." I helped her to her feet. She was weak, her movements hitching as if she were learning to walk again. I pressed the internal latch, and the wine rack swung open. The opulent basement, with its polished marble and climate-controlled racks, felt like a tomb. I knew Dylan's schedule. He was at a Visionaries gala downtown, but his security system was a living thing, watching us through the unblinking red eyes of the cameras tucked into the molding. "Keep your head down," I commanded, shielding her with my bulk. We moved through the shadows of the grand foyer. Every floorboard that creaked sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous silence of the mansion. My pulse thundered in my ears as we reached the heavy mahogany front door. I bypassed the smart lock with a manual override I'd spotted on my way in, a relic of the original build that Dylan's high-tech gadgets couldn't fully erase. The cool night air hit our faces, sharp and sweet. I led her toward my old truck, parked discreetly down the drive. As the engine turned over, the headlights swept across the darkened windows of the mansion. For a second, I thought I saw a curtain move on the second floor, but I didn't wait to find out. I threw the truck into gear, gravel spraying as we tore down the winding driveway. I looked at Brittany, huddled in the passenger seat clutching the wooden music box, and I knew the man I had been, the quiet, grieving retiree, was dead. I had my daughter back, and I was going to tear down everything Dylan Cross had built to keep her safe. The tires hummed a low, mournful tune against the asphalt as we left the city lights behind, heading toward the small, lakeside cabin owned by my old foreman, Gus. Brittany sat huddled in the passenger seat, the heater blasting, yet she wouldn't stop shivering. She clutched the music box like a lifebuoy in a storm. 4 miles, she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the dark silhouettes of the passing trees, until finally, her voice broke the silence, thin and fragile, like dry parchment. He planned it all, Dad. From the very second he saw the terms of Grandpa's trust. I kept my eyes on the road, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. I knew the trust she meant. It was a massive sum intended for her 35th birthday, or, in the event of her death, a total payout to her spouse. The night of the accident, she continued, her gaze drifting to the dashboard as if seeing a ghost in the glass, we weren't supposed to be on that coastal road. He said he wanted to see the moon over the cliffs. Suddenly, the dashboard lights started flickering. The locks clicked shut, on their own. I tried to roll down the window, but the electronics were dead. Then the steering wheel just locked. My stomach turned. As a builder, I knew that if you control the infrastructure, you control the inhabitant. Dylan didn't just understand code, he understood how to weaponize it. He'd installed a bypass module in my car weeks before, she whispered. He was controlling the vehicle from his phone in the passenger seat. He steered us toward the embankment at 40 miles an hour and jumped out just before we hit the barrier. I remember the smell of gasoline and the heat of the spark he'd rigged in the trunk. He dragged me out before the fire spread, but he didn't save me. He just moved me from one cage to another. She told me how he'd used a body from a medical supply contact, someone he'd bribed or blackmailed, to leave in the driver's seat. By the time the flames were doused, the remains were unrecognizable and Dylan's grief was so convincing it had fooled everyone, including the dental record investigators he'd likely paid off. He had spent 3 years building a masterpiece of deception, using the $25 million payout to fund the very mansion where he'd kept her entombed. He told me if I ever tried to scream, he'd make sure you were the next one in a car accident, she said, a single tear finally tracking through the grime on her cheek. I reached over and took her hand. It was cold, but the fire rising in my chest was enough to keep us both warm. Dylan Cross thought he was a master architect of lies, but he had forgotten one thing. I spent 40 years learning how to tear down faulty foundations. Gus didn't ask questions when I showed up at his cabin in the middle of the night with a traumatized woman who was supposed to be dead. He just handed me the keys to his old workshop and a heavy-duty crowbar, his eyes lingering on Brittany with a mixture of shock and a veteran's grim understanding. Leaving Brittany under Gus's watchful eye, I called Leo, a retired precinct captain who owed me for a favor back when we were both younger and believed the world was simpler. The air at the Pine Ridge Cemetery was thick with a damp, clinging fog that swallowed the beams of our flashlights. It was nearly 2 in the morning, the kind of hour when the silence of a graveyard feels heavy enough to crush you. Leo stood by the granite headstone, the one I'd paid $5,000 for, engraved with words of love that now felt like a cruel joke. "You're sure about this, Mike?" Leo whispered, his breath hitching in the cold. "If we're caught, there's no talking our way out of a felony." "I buried my heart in this dirt, Leo," I said, shoving the shovel blade into the turf. "I need to know what's actually inside it." We worked in a rhythmic, desperate silence. The sound of metal hitting soil was rhythmic, a grim construction project in reverse. After an hour of digging, the shovel struck something that didn't sound like wood. It was a hollow, metallic ring. We cleared the rest by hand, revealing the high-end steel casket Dylan had insisted on, the best for the best, he'd said while wiping away fake tears at the funeral. Leo used the crowbar to bypass the locking mechanism. The seal broke with a hiss of escaping air. I braced myself for the smell of decay, for the sight that had haunted my nightmares for 3 years. But as the lid groaned open, there was only the scent of dry velvet and cold metal. I shone my light inside. There were no remains. No charred fragments of my daughter. Instead, the casket was filled with industrial paving stones and bags of construction sand, carefully weighted to mimic the heft of a human body. Tucked into the corner, as if Dylan couldn't resist one final insult, was a heap of charred debris from a local scrapyard, twisted wires and melted plastic meant to fool a casual glance if the grave were ever disturbed. Leo cursed softly, the beam of his light shaking. He didn't just fake her death, Mike. He staged a burial for a pile of trash. I stared down at the stones. For 3 years, I had come here to talk to a pile of construction waste. The grief that had been a dull ache for 1,000 days sharpened into a cold, jagged edge. I wasn't just a grieving father anymore. I was a man who had found the flaw in the foundation, and I knew exactly how much pressure it would take to make the whole structure collapse. "Cover it up," I said, my voice as cold as the granite markers surrounding us. "We have what we need. It's time to stop mourning and start building a cage for a monster." The dirt from the cemetery was still under my fingernails as I sat in Leo's dim home office, the blue light of the computer screen reflecting off his tired face. I felt like a man walking through a house he'd built, only to find the foundation was made of glass. Leo was a wizard with old-school connections, the kind of guy who knew which digital doors to knock on when the official ones were locked. "Mike, you need to see this," Leo muttered, tapping the screen. I leaned in, my eyes scanning a scanned document that bore the elegant, sweeping signature of Brittany's grandfather. It was the Davenport Legacy Trust. My father-in-law had been a hard man, a man of old money and deep suspicions, and he'd set up a safety net for Brittany that I never fully understood the scale of. 25 million, I whispered, the number feeling heavy and cold. "Look at the payout clause," Leo pointed out. "It's a standard age-based release at 35. But there's a fast-track contingency. In the event of the beneficiary's untimely passing, the entire principal is released immediately to the surviving spouse to manage the estate's interests. No questions asked, no waiting period." We tracked the timeline. The car fire had been reported at 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. The death certificate was signed by a friendly coroner at 8 a.m. the following morning. By noon that same Wednesday, while I was still sitting in a stupor in my living room clutching Brittany's high school graduation photo, Dylan's lawyers had already filed the claim. The money hit his account 48 hours later. "He didn't just kill her off on paper for a payout," I said, a bitter realization settling in my gut. "He used her own inheritance to build the prison he kept her in. That mansion, the tech, the security, she paid for it all with her own death." I scrolled further, looking for the footprint Dylan thought he'd covered. There it was, a series of offshore transfers labeled as consulting fees that funneled a portion of the trust back into a private security firm, the same firm that provided the high-tech monitoring for Dylan's estate. It was a closed loop. He had turned her legacy into a self-sustaining cage. The polished, grieving entrepreneur I'd known for years was gone. In his place was a scavenger who had picked his wife's life clean before she was even cold in the grave he'd faked for her. I stood up, my joints popping in the quiet room. I'd spent my life following blueprints and building things to last. Now, I was looking at a structure built on greed and blood. I didn't need a sledgehammer to bring it down. I just needed to find the one pillar that held his ego together and pull. I was sitting on my porch, watching the sun dip behind the tree line, when the low, electric hum of a luxury SUV drifted up the driveway. I didn't need to look to know it was him. Dylan Cross stepped out of the vehicle, his dark hair perfectly slicked and his sharp features highlighted by the golden hour. He looked like the picture of a grieving widower, but all I saw was the predator who had filled a casket with stones. "Michael," he said, his voice smooth and practiced as he walked up the steps. "I called, but you didn't answer. I was worried." "I've been busy, Dylan," I replied, my voice steady, betraying nothing. "Just catching up on some old projects." He sat in the chair opposite mine, leaning forward with a look of manufactured concern. He placed a hand on his knee, the sunlight catching the expensive watch he'd bought with Brittany's money. "I know these anniversaries are hard. 3 years. It doesn't get easier, does it?" I find myself wandering through the mansion, half expecting to hear her laugh. The bile rose in my throat. I wondered if he heard her laugh when he was locking the reinforced door in his basement, or if he only heard her screams. "The mansion," I said, tilting my head. "It's a big house for one man. Must be hard to keep track of everything in there. All those rooms." Dylan's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened, turning as cold as the steel in his wine cellar. The mask was still on, but the edges were fraying. "It's a fortress, Michael. Secure. Private. I've invested a lot in making sure nothing gets in or out without my permission." He paused, letting the silence hang between us like a threat. "I noticed someone was at the estate yesterday. The security logs showed a manual override on the front door. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" I met his gaze, my blue eyes reflecting the calm of a man who had already laid the foundation for a collapse. "I'm a retired builder, Dylan. I tend to notice when things aren't built right. Sometimes you have to go back in to fix a flaw before the whole structure comes down on your head." Dylan stood up, the charismatic entrepreneur replaced by something much more dangerous. He smoothed his suit jacket, his movements precise. "Be careful, Michael. You're getting older. You wouldn't want to have an accident. The roads around here are treacherous, just like the ones on the coast." He thought he was marking his territory. He thought he was reminding me of his power. He had no idea that while he was sitting on my porch, Brittany was 20 miles away, being fed and protected by men he couldn't buy. He was so focused on the old man in the rocking chair that he didn't realize the walls of his own fortress were already beginning to crack. "Thanks for the advice, Dylan," I said as he walked back to his car. "I'll be sure to keep my eyes on the road." After Dylan's SUV disappeared down the road, I didn't go back to my rocking chair. I headed straight for the basement, where I kept the old flat file cabinets from my days as a site supervisor. I pulled out a dusty roll of architectural drawings, the original structural plans for the Cross estate. I'd helped consult on the framing before Dylan had fired my crew and brought in his own, specialized contractors to finish the interior and the tech integration. "You should have known better, Dylan," I whispered, tracing the lines of the load-bearing walls. "A builder always keeps the bones." I met Leo an hour later at a nondescript 24-hour diner. He slid a laptop across the cracked Formica table. He had spent the afternoon diving into the digital side of Dylan's fortress. While I had the physical bones, Leo had found the nervous system. "He's running the entire house on a proprietary OS called Aegis," Leo explained, his voice low against the hum of the refrigerator. "It controls everything. The locks, the cameras, the HVAC, even the sound system. It's supposed to be unhackable. But Dylan is arrogant. He designed the software himself, and every architect leaves a signature." Leo clicked through several layers of code until a 3D rendering of the mansion appeared on the screen. It was beautiful and terrifying, a grid of sensors that could detect a heartbeat in the hallway. But as I cross-referenced the digital map with my physical blueprints, I saw it. In the guest wing, near the secondary server room, there was a discrepancy. The digital map showed a solid wall, but my structural plans showed a ventilation bypass designed for high-heat server cooling. "There," I said, pointing to the gap. "If the system loses primary power, the fire suppression protocol forced those dampers to open manually. It's a physical override required by the county building code." Dylan couldn't code his way around the law. "And here's the kicker," Leo added, his fingers flying across the keys. "I found a God mode backdoor in the software. It's an administrative entry point he uses for remote maintenance. The password wasn't a string of numbers or symbols. It was Brittany's birthday followed by the date of her accident. The man is a sociopath. He used the day he destroyed her life as the key to his kingdom." I looked at the blinking cursor on the screen. To Dylan, this mansion was a masterpiece of control. To me, it was now a structure with a fatal flaw. I knew how to get in, and thanks to Leo, I knew how to turn the house against its master. We weren't just looking at blueprints anymore, we were looking at the schematics for a trap. Dylan thought he was safe behind his glass and steel, but he had forgotten the most basic rule of construction. If you don't respect the foundation, the whole thing is eventually coming down. The following night, the air was still and heavy with the scent of pine as Leo and I sat in the back of his van, parked a quarter-mile from Dylan's perimeter fence. The interior was cramped, smelling of stale coffee and hot electronics. Leo had tapped into the God mode backdoor, and the mansion's entire digital skeleton was laid bare on the glowing monitors before us. "We're in," Leo whispered, his fingers dancing across the keys. "Initiating the Ghost protocol." At the mansion, the operation began with the subtlety of a shifting foundation. We started with the lighting. Using the administrative override, we programmed the high-end recessed LEDs to flicker, not a frantic strobe, but a slow, rhythmic pulse that matched the tempo of a human heartbeat. In the master suite, the smart glass windows transitioned from transparent to opaque and back again, a silent, rhythmic breathing of the architecture itself. From our remote feed, we watched the interior cameras. Dylan appeared in the hallway, his silk robe billowing, his face a mask of confusion. He checked the wall panels, but Leo had looped the diagnostic screens to show system optimal. Now the audio, I said, my voice low. Through the hidden speakers Dylan had installed to surround himself with luxury, we played a sound he would recognize in his marrow, the faint, mechanical melody of Britney's wooden music box. It was a distorted, digital echo that seemed to drift from behind the walls, impossible to pinpoint. Dylan froze in the center of the foyer, his polished confidence visibly cracking. He shouted for the system to stop, but the voice recognition software had been redirected. Every time he spoke, the house responded by dimming the lights another 10%. He's panicking, Leo noted. He's trying to reboot the main server. Let him, I replied. Every time he tries to fix a bug, we'll open a new door. We spent the next 3 hours turning his sanctuary into a labyrinth. We triggered the climate control to drop the temperature in the basement to a bone-chilling 40 degrees, while the upstairs surged with heat. We unlatched the heavy oak wine rack, the one that had hidden my daughter, and let it swing open and shut, over and over, the heavy industrial click echoing through the empty halls. To the world, Dylan Cross was a tech genius who controlled every variable. But tonight, he was just a man in a glass box, haunted by the digital ghost of the woman he'd tried to delete. As I watched him frantically pacing the halls of his fortress, I realized that the psychological walls he'd built were far thinner than the concrete ones I'd poured. We weren't just malfunctioning his house, we were dismantling his mind, one line of code at a time. Dylan had used technology to bury the truth, but now, the truth was using technology to bury him. The following evening, I sent the text that served as the final structural support for the trap. I know what's in the basement, Dylan. Meet me there at midnight or the police get the blueprints. I arrived early, slipping through the ventilation bypass I'd identified in the blueprints. The mansion was silent, though the air felt charged with the digital residue of the ghosting we'd put Dylan through. I waited in the shadows of the wine cellar, the heavy scent of oak and expensive sediment surrounding me. At exactly midnight, the elevator hummed to life. Dylan stepped out, his face haggard and his eyes darting toward the flickering overhead lights. He wasn't the polished entrepreneur anymore. He was a man losing his grip on the very world he'd tried to engineer. "Michael," he shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You think you can play games with me? This is my house. My system." I stepped out from behind the rack, the wooden music box in my hand. "It was never yours, Dylan. You bought the materials, but you didn't understand the load-bearing truth of this place." He lunged toward me, but I was already moving toward the soundproof door. I stepped inside the small, airless room where Brittany had spent 3 years. Dylan followed, his rage blinding him to the obvious geometry of the situation. "You're an old man, Michael. You're going to stay here just like she did." "I don't think so," I said, my voice calm. I reached behind the door frame, feeling for the manual fire safety override, a physical lever that bypassed every line of code Dylan had ever written. It was a failsafe required by the very building codes he'd ignored. With a sharp tug, I engaged the emergency lockout. The heavy, reinforced door slammed shut with a finality that shook the floor. I stepped back just as the electromagnetic locks engaged, a sound like a deadbolt on a tomb. Dylan threw himself against the glass, his muffled screams barely reaching my ears through the soundproofing. He frantically punched his codes into the internal keypad, but Leo had already initiated a total system wipe. The screen merely blinked with a single message: "System unauthorized." I stood there for a moment, looking through the reinforced glass at the man who had stolen my daughter's life. He was trapped in the very masterpiece he had built for her. He had designed this room to be a place where no one would ever hear a cry for help. As I walked away, leaving him in the dark and the cold, I realized that I hadn't just locked a door. I had finally completed the demolition of Dylan Cross. The foundation was gone, and for the first time in 3 years, the weight on my chest had finally lifted. I stood in the center of the dark mansion server room, the only light coming from the rhythmic pulse of the server racks Leo had hacked. On the wall of monitors, I could see Dylan through the reinforced glass of the basement vault. He was no longer the arrogant architect of his own fortune. He was a panicked animal, clawing at the soundproofed walls as the temperature in the room continued to drop. "Leo, open the audio channel," I said quietly. The intercom crackled to life, and Dylan's voice filled the room, jagged and desperate. "Michael! Michael, I know you're listening. Open this door. It's freezing in here and the air, I can't breathe." I leaned into the microphone, my voice as steady as a plumb line. "The air is fine, Dylan. You're just feeling the weight of 3 years of silence. But if you want out, you're going to have to give me the one thing you've been hoarding. I want the truth. I'll give you anything. The money, the mansion, it's all yours," he shrieked, his breath visible in the chilled air of the vault. "I don't want your money, Dylan. I want to hear how you faked the accident. I want to hear about the medical contact, the inheritance, and how you planned to let my daughter rot while you lived in a house she paid for." "Fine. Fine." Dylan's pride finally shattered under the cold. He began to spill it all: the digital bypass he'd used to lock her car, the bribe he'd paid to the coroner to sign off on the charred remains, and the systematic way he had drugged Brittany to keep her compliant. He spoke with a frantic, sickening pride, thinking he was bargaining for his life. He didn't realize that every word, every stutter, and every confession was being streamed directly to the fleet of police cruisers that were currently screaming up the winding driveway. I watched the monitors as blue and red lights began to dance across the glass exterior of the mansion. The fortress was being breached. "I did it for us, Michael. For the legacy," Dylan cried out, his voice cracking. "Now open the door." "The door is on a timer, Dylan," I lied, though there was no more need for deception. "Just like the one you put Brittany on. Only your time is up." The front doors of the mansion were breached by the tactical team, their heavy boots thundering across the marble floors I had once helped frame. I stood up, taking the recording device from Leo. As I walked toward the elevator to meet the officers and lead them to my daughter's captor, I took one last look at the house. It was a beautiful structure, but it was built on a lie, and today, the final inspection was complete. The truth had finally brought the whole thing down. The Seattle fog had finally lifted, replaced by a soft, amber sunlight that pooled on the porch of our old family home. It had been 6 months since the sirens had faded at Dylan's mansion, and for the first time in 3 years, the silence of the morning didn't feel like an empty room. It felt like peace. Brittany stood by the kitchen window, her chestnut hair catching the light as she spoke into her headset. She was no longer the ghost I'd found in that basement. She had found a new kind of strength, working as a lead advocate for a foundation dedicated to victims of high-stakes domestic abuse and financial coercion. I listened to her voice, steady, compassionate, and unwavering, as she guided another woman through the steps of reclaiming an identity that had been stolen. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was an architect of hope for people who were still trapped in their own hidden rooms. "I'll see you at the community center tonight," she said, ending the call with a small, genuine smile. She looked out at me and waved, a gesture that still made my chest tighten with a gratitude I couldn't put into words. I turned back to the garden bed in front of me. For 40 years, my hands had been calloused by rough timber, heavy steel, and the unforgiving vibration of power tools. I had spent my life building structures meant to withstand the world. But today, my hands were deep in the cool, damp earth. I had traded my heavy construction boots for garden shoes and my framing hammer for a pair of bypass shears. As I carefully pruned the rose bushes Jennifer had planted decades ago, I realized that I was still a builder. I was just working with different materials now. Instead of pouring concrete foundations, I was nurturing the roots of my daughter's new life. Instead of locking doors to keep people out, I was opening up a space for things to grow. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with soil, not grease or sawdust. The weight of the world, the heavy burden of the silent observer I used to be, had been buried alongside the lies Dylan Cross had tried to build his life upon. My daughter was safe, the truth had been spoken, and the house of cards had finally fallen. I clipped a stray branch, wiped the dirt from my brow, and felt the warmth of the sun on my back. For the first time in a long time, the foundation was solid. I was finally retired, and for once, the work was finished. I stepped away from the garden, wiping the soil from my palms, and sat on the porch steps. I've spent 40 years working with blueprints, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that a house, just like a person, is only as good as what's underneath. If you're watching this, I want you to take a long look at the structures in your own life. Because the most vital lesson I've gained is that the truth has a specific weight and a geometry that simply cannot be ignored. Dylan Cross thought he was a master architect. He thought he could engineer a reality built on deception, using high-tech cages to bury my daughter and greed to fuel his empire. But he forgot that a facade is just a thin skin. My superpower wasn't just knowing how to read blueprints. It was having the patience to look for the tiny gaps where the lie doesn't quite meet the truth. Here is what I hope you take away from my journey. First, trust your intuition over the polished facade. Just because something looks successful, expensive, or perfect doesn't mean it's solid. If a fraction of an inch feels off in a relationship or a deal, do not look away. That small gap is usually where the truth is hiding, waiting for someone with the courage to touch it. Second, understand the danger of passivity. I'll be honest with you, for years I stayed quiet to keep the peace. I felt something wasn't right with Dylan, but I chose to be a silent observer. I've learned that silence isn't always dignity. Sometimes, it's just a door left unlocked for a predator. True protection requires the strength to ask the hard questions before the tragedy occurs. Third, accountability is inescapable. You cannot build a life on someone else's destruction and expect it to stand. Dylan's own, smart, house became his tomb because he built it on a foundation of malice. Every choice you make is a brick in the structure of your character. Make sure yours can pass an inspection. And finally, remember that resilience is the best architect. Look at my Brittany. She was kept in the dark for 3 years, but she didn't break. She took that trauma and turned it into a foundation for others. No matter how deep the basement you find yourself in today, you have the internal blueprints to rebuild something even stronger than what was stolen from you. Life is about the final inspection. When the sun hits the house you've built, you want to be sure it stands for something real. If this story of justice and a father's intuition resonated with you, please consider subscribing so you won't miss our future stories. A gentle reminder, while inspired by real-world themes of recovery and resilience, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. Thank you for watching.